Thanks, Karishma. So I'm going to take you through a look at retail and what we consider the new normal today. My name is Barry Murray. I'm an EMEA Insights Manager here for the Microsoft Bing Ads. So just going through, we're going to start off having a look at what we've kind of seen in terms of consumer behavior throughout COVID. And then moving on from that, what that means for the next 6 months and beyond, looking at retail with a search lens, and how you as an advertiser can make the most of the situation and kind of get through it the best you can as well. So starting off, we'll have a look at consumer confidence. I think there's always a good kind of measure to gauge how the market's responding to the current situation. And one thing we've actually seen is that consumer confidence now is lower than it was in the last big recession around 2008, which is quite a shocking dip, and it's continuing to dip as well. We've data up until June there. So even with slight restrictions being lifted, we're still seeing consumers hesitant to make those big purchases, and just that general lack of confidence in the retail sector. Another thing that we've actually spotted is that the retail sales growth from a year-on-year perspective has actually dipped quite significantly as well. So we look on the left-hand side graph, this is the last recession, and on the right-hand side, we've got 2019 and 2020. And one of the things you'll notice, that little red X here on the left-hand side, that's where we are in terms of consumer confidence now compared to last recession. So we're now at a comparable consumer confidence, which is, it's obviously not fantastic. And as well, the retail sales growth was at about -18, has moved back up now to about -9. But again, it's one of the biggest dips that we've seen in retail sales growth, obviously with the close of the high street stores. So just obviously we've got these challenges in the market and in retail. One thing that we have seen though, which is quite good news, is that the ratio of online, well, good news for search, is that the online percentage compared to offline of retail sales has taken a massive jump. Again, obviously with high street stores closed, you kind of expect this, but just to put into perspective how big a shift in dynamic this is, each one of these kind of spikes you can see throughout this graph is around about November, Black Friday peak season, and that causes generally around a 3% shift in the split of people shopping from high street stores to online. And in contrast, the change in split that we've seen from around about March is around about 14% of a shift, which is around about 5 times the impact Black Friday and peak season has on pushing people towards online shopping. So it's a huge and significant shift. And this is what we're seeing in the industry. But if we take a bit of a deeper dive and go into search, we're seeing that on our side reflected in our verticals. So taking a look at some of the kind of higher level lens verticals that we have in retail, like apparel, beauty and personal care, we've seen these kind of adjust throughout COVID. So what we're seeing here, each one of these sections is from lockdown, so around about 15th of March, just before lockdown, to the 30th of May. And what we're actually seeing is the trend of how consumers are searching and clicking for these products. So in apparel, we took we saw kind of year-on-year growth was below what we would expect, below the norm. And then that kind of, as people adjusted to lockdown, we saw that kind of change, and people became more accustomed to that changing lifestyle and adapted. And then we saw a bit of interest pick up again in apparel, and that growth is kind of slowly continuing. Where, for example, in beauty and personal care, taking an example, the year-on-year growth has been huge. Obviously, predominantly driven by personal care items like disinfectant and antibacterial products. If we look at consumer and computers, consumer electronics and computers, we did see that growth kind of stunted at the start of lockdown, but then start to pick up again, and we're seeing some more traction there for that as well. That growth was initially predominantly driven by work from home products like peripherals. Food and groceries, we saw a very high initial spike, with obviously people trying to get food and groceries in. That's kind of tapered off over time as I think people have become more accustomed and are adapting to that lockdown scenario. So just to kind of show how some of our verticals have responded and reacted to this kind of changing ecosystem we have. And if we look at the micro trends, there's a couple of things that have kind of spiked as a result of these trends we're seeing. Like if we look at apparel, for example, we did see that growth, but it wasn't in all areas. So we saw really aggressive spikes in things like loungewear. Obviously, people stuck at home or maybe in a situation where they're potentially furloughed. They're looking for something to be comfortable at home, and we saw a big spike in loungewear, kind of underwear, and sportswear initially as well, as people took up a kind of a fitness trend. We saw that in sports and fitness equipment, and as well as that the apparel. Beauty and personal care, we have seen body care, skin care, hair care. Like we saw that initial growth, and that's continued to trend upwards, with an example of body care at a 164% growth at the end of, or at the start of June. And just to point out some of the micro trends that they do, when you see those trends at a macro level at L1, they can be quite indicative of the vertical. But if you dig in as well, certain products are actually driving micro trends, and it might not necessarily reflect the whole vertical. So in terms of what lies ahead, I think is the most important thing, because we're now in a situation where restrictions are being lifted, dynamics are changing in the marketplace, and obviously some of the trends we've seen will stay, some will not. As Krishna mentioned, we're seeing an influx of new searchers onto the network, and we're seeing increased search activity and different behaviors as well. So I think in terms of planning, the most important thing to do is consider what kind of disruptions you could potentially see in the marketplace. So when I think of future kind of 6 months, there's probably 3 kind of key scenarios that could happen. And so one of them, a second wave. Hopefully this doesn't, happen and pick up, but we could see a second wave of the epidemic kind of kick in. So what we might see as a result of that, from a search advertising perspective, we might see those restrictions kind of halt a vertical's recovery. So we will see kind of stunted performance and search activity in that particular vertical. But we might also see, as a result of the first wave, a lot of businesses now have an improved online setup. So we might see an increase of businesses able to deal with that situation and with business solutions in place. So you might see an increase in competition as a result of a second wave. So, and as well as that, some of the key things I would say to think of when you think of that scenario, behavior, like judging from our first wave, people became a bit more conservative with their purchasing behavior, but we also saw completely new behavior, and as well as that, an influx of new queries to the network, because it's something completely new. So people use search then to search for new things that they've never searched for before, or maybe potentially had a need for before. So they're the kind of things to think of when you think of second wave. The more negative scenario that we could potentially hit is a deep recession. So, we could come back to normal, things kind of level off, but unfortunately the impact and knock-on effect of that first wave of COVID causes a deep recession. So some things we might see from a search point of view is that budgets are going to be restricted with a deep recession, and decrease in consumer confidence will kind of restrict some of the higher purchase, higher price point products in the marketplace as well. So what and we're going to see as well, as a result of that, budgets, time resources, marketing resources as well, pulled back and restricted, and as well as that conservative behavior from purchasers and consumers in the marketplace. So it'd be obviously a more challenging scenario. And then we have a more positive, which is markets recover. We don't see a second wave, but at the same time, that market is kind of forcibly evolved in a way that we haven't seen before. So we will see, advertisers and searches return to that normal campaign activity. We might see some initial low competition in some verticals where people are kind of adjusting to that dynamic change. But another thing that we might see, and I think is often maybe overlooked, is that a lot of the products that we saw happen or get this kind of influx of activity earlier in the year are actually longer lifetime products that people wouldn't go out and buy every 6 months, for example. So what we might see is that those spikes that we would expect later in the year for some products don't actually happen because they've happened earlier in the year. But in a scenario like that, what we'd probably expect with a recovery is an increase in search volume and an increase in queries and behavior as new people have been pushed onto an online kind of mindset, and they're going from buying essentials to commodities. So that would be obviously the ideal scenario from a search marketing point of view. So in terms of if we think of how will these scenarios, how do we kind of consider how these will impact peak season? So obviously traditionally peak season drives yearly performance for most retail advertisers. It's a significant point throughout the year and a really important one in terms of sales. And obviously Black Friday being the driving force, Black Friday week and Black Friday. When we have a look at an adjusted click forecast for this year, so this is looking at 2019 and 2020 performance, but also factoring in some of the behavior we would see in a new normal situation, like in we'll say a recovery situation. So no second wave, no recession. We do actually see strong growth from the confidence that people have displayed through search performance. That kind of dip in consumer confidence is easing off. So we predict that there will actually be some growth if things kind of have that steady return to normal. But it's highly dependent on the economic situation, naturally. But if we think of the three scenarios that we talked about, taking some of the key verticals. So here we have apparel and home and garden. And you can see that apparel, while we did see that kind of stunt towards the start of lockdown, we've seen that performance pick up, and we're now in year-on-year growth from a supply, from a search volume point of view, and we're seeing that reflected in the clicks as well. And we predict that will, in a normal situation, we will maintain that growth, and we will see positive performance year-on-year for apparel, and the same with home and garden. With home and garden, it's slightly different in the sense that we've seen that kind of surge as people were kind of confined during lockdown for gardening products and pastimes to do with home and garden and kitting out their garden, because if they were restricted to indoors, that's kind of what a lot of people were doing. But if we return to normal, we might actually see a decrease in that activity as people are more allowed outside and the confidence in going outside increases. So we will see that kind of taper off, but still maintain that year-on-year growth. But if we look at it from a second wave perspective, in apparel, when we factor that in, we might actually see that consumer confidence be restricted, which will result in a lower kind of supply of searches into the network, and we might see a kind of a matching year-on-year performance initially, at least. And home and garden, we might actually see that increase again and maintain that kind of increased volume. And then if we look at it from a recession point of view, we might actually see a slight decline in apparel as people become more conservative with their purchases. And the same for home and garden, we might see that kind of stay at a slightly elevated level, but still restricted as people kind of pull back on those purchases they would have made. And we're seeing, I would say the important thing to do is kind of assess continuously which kind of scenario that we are closest to in terms of economic situation. I mean, things have changed quite rapidly in the market, and there's week-on-week changes. It's still fluctuating quite aggressively. So I think it needs to be a strategic kind of approach to continuously assess the economic situation. And if we look at beauty and consumer electronics, just to look at the other kind of major L1 verticals, from a normal perspective, beauty, we saw that kind of spike up with lockdown, and we maintained that year-on-year growth. Consumer electronics, the same. We might see a bit of a dip though, as we might not see the same expected spike during peak season because those long lifetime products have already happened. And we know with a second wave, we might see that stunted, and deep recession again further stunted. So something to bear in mind. So we've talked about these three kind of scenarios. There's also a specific set of challenges. You've heard me mention consumer confidence again and again. What that really means is the likelihood of making an expensive purchase. So we might still see that kind of lower price point performance continue. But if we see that consumer confidence continue to decrease, larger purchases, higher mid to high end purchase products will be most likely restricted, and we'll see a dip in supply for them. But it also means that we'll see a couple of other things happen, like a increase in comparison searches with people focusing on cost. So a good way to kind of adapt your strategy to that situation is to incorporate some of those terms and that strategy, like those cost searches and comparison searches, incorporate that into your keywords and ad copy to capture that kind of changing dynamic, that changing performance with consumers. Also, we might see a reduction in purchases on traditional sales days. If people are more reluctant and that confidence is restricted, and as well as that, I mean, this year we might see a situation where advertisers can't give the same discounts as they did last year due to the situation and their financial situation. So we might see people pull back in those traditional days and those purchases spread around the season as opposed to in specific pockets. So that's something to focus on, I would say, for this year, is that increased opportunity outside of peak times. Looking at another scenario, another challenge that we've got this year is that organically induced change that we saw in seasonality. So longer lifetime products, higher price products that were previously, you would see people hold off to peak times during the year, or a lot of them would happen later in the year around Black Friday and peak. That was kind of prematurely induced early in the year. So what we might see this year is that kind of lack of search volume and maybe a spreading of that search volume around peak season. And if it's something that you're not prepared for and built into campaigns, you might actually lose out on that. So it's important to kind of really focus on things that you might not expect in the industry this year. And there's a quite an interesting study that I've linked in there. But here's some of the kind of expected lifetimes of some key products on our network. So anything over, I would say, 6 months that you would expect to be sold around Black Friday. If that spike happened early in the year, likelihood is that's not going to happen to the same extent in Black Friday. It's going to be muted. So that's something to bear in mind when planning campaigns. Now, in terms of the kind of responding to this disruption, I mean, there's a myriad of ways that you can. If we think of the key things that we've mentioned, we've got search volume, we've got new queries entering the auction that have never been typed before, new behaviors with new people who've never kind of focused on online shopping before, they're now online and shopping. But also as well, we have a lot of people furloughed, we have budgets restricted, so time resource is now restricted, budgets are restricted, and we might see conservative behavior for consumer confidence being so low as well. So there's a couple of things that we can do from a campaign management point of view to kind of adapt to this. I would say one key thing is use a broad approach. There are things happening in the market, new searches coming in, new behaviors. It's very, very difficult to predict these things accurately. So having a broad approach is very important, especially in this economic situation. So dynamic search ads, broad keywords, put some campaign budgets on there to control cost. And this will allow you to catch those new queries and behaviors coming into the marketplace. And to pull them in and then make them cost effective, through exact match. But as well as that, channels as well, making sure that you cover as much as possible. As people are spending more time online, they're going to explore different channels. So things like the Microsoft Audience Network, it's a perfect time to try something like that out to make sure that you've got full coverage and the best chance of catching those people and bringing them into that search journey. Remarketing as well. So it might seem a no-brainer, but as well as that, having varying time ranges, so 1, 3, 7, 14 days. As people start to investigate new products they never would have before, you can catch them with those remarketing lists aimed at 1 to 3 days, and then bring them into that search journey. Time and budget, we can easily do them with automated solutions. There's a couple of different options that you have, like automated bidding, enhanced CPC, CPA targets, things like that. It now is like the best time if you feel like you're going to be time resourced challenged, rather than saying, I'll let things continue on as they are and we'll come back to it. If you put the time into implementing these solutions, then you have the time then to divert towards optimizing campaigns. So you'll end up with a better cost efficiency at the end of the day. And then messaging as well. Ad copy is really key. Consumers are responding really positively to people who are taking a stance, helping the community and their people, and being socially responsive. So I think it's important to make sure that ad copy is adjusted for the current situation. And that's it. So I mean, hopefully that's helpful. It's given some insight into what's kind of coming up in the next 6 months, some of the challenges that we have, how search is adapting to that, and some of the tactics you can take to adapt to those changing situations in the network. And with that, I'll pass this on to Nitin, who will take us through some of our products and take you through that.